Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of royal tradition meet modern diplomacy, a single dinner conversation would send shockwaves through both sides of the Atlantic. What was meant to be an elegant evening of diplomatic courtesy between two world leaders transformed into a moment that palace insiders would whisper about for months to come. The scene was set perfectly. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light over priceless china, the finest wines from the royal cellars, and a menu crafted by the world's most skilled chefs. King Charles III, in his most formal regalia, had prepared to host what should have been a routine state dinner. Donald Trump, fresh from his return to the presidency, arrived with his characteristic confidence and unpredictable nature. But as the evening unfolded, witnesses would later describe a moment so unexpected, so completely unfiltered, that even the most experienced palace staff stood frozen in disbelief. The king's carefully planned evening of diplomatic pleasantries was about to take a turn that no protocol manual could have prepared anyone for. What happened next would become the subject of hushed conversations in royal circles, emergency meetings among diplomatic staff, and headlines that would capture the world's attention. This is the true story of that unforgettable night, told through the eyes of those who were there, witnessed it all, and lived to tell the tale that shook the very foundations of international diplomacy. The truth, as they say, is stranger than fiction, and sometimes it's far more entertaining. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Buckingham Palace as Margaret Stevens, the head of royal protocol, made her final inspection of the state dining room. Every detail had been meticulously planned for months. The Georgian silver gleamed under the warm light, each piece positioned with mathematical precision. The flowers, specially flown in from the royal gardens at Sandringham, created elegant centerpieces that would photograph beautifully for the official records.
Margaret had been organising state dinners for nearly 2 decades, serving under 3 different monarchs.
She prided herself on anticipating every possible scenario, every diplomatic nuance that might arise during these carefully choreographed events. But today felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that this evening would test every lesson she had learned about international diplomacy. President Donald Trump's motorcade was scheduled to arrive at precisely 6:30. The timing had been debated extensively by both American and British diplomatic teams. Too early might suggest over-eagerness, too late could be interpreted as disrespect. 6:30 struck the perfect balance of importance and courtesy that such occasions demanded. King Charles III had spent the morning reviewing briefing documents prepared by his private secretaries. The relationship between Britain and America had always been described as special, but recent years had brought new complexities to that partnership. The king understood that tonight's dinner was about more than just good food and pleasant conversation. It was about setting the tone for future cooperation between two nations whose histories were deeply intertwined. In the palace kitchens, Chef Antoine Dubois supervised the preparation of a menu that had been approved by both royal and presidential dietary staff. The first course would feature Scottish salmon prepared with herbs from the palace gardens. The main course showcased the finest Welsh lamb, accompanied by seasonal vegetables sourced from organic farms across the British countryside. For dessert, a traditional English trifle would be presented alongside American-style apple pie, a small but meaningful gesture toward their guests' preferences. The guest list had been carefully curated to include influential figures from both sides of the Atlantic. British cabinet ministers would sit alongside American diplomats, business leaders would engage with royal family members, and cultural ambassadors would bridge any gaps in conversation that might arise. Each seating arrangement had been planned to encourage meaningful dialogue while avoiding potentially contentious pairings. Lady Catherine Pemberton, the King's longtime friend and trusted advisor, arrived early to offer her support. She had witnessed countless state occasions and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when events might veer off script. As she walked through the reception rooms, checking flower arrangements and ensuring that conversation areas were properly configured, she noticed the subtle tension among the staff. The palace servants, trained to maintain perfect composure under any circumstances, moved with an extra layer of precision today. They had heard the stories about President Trump's unconventional approach to formal occasions. Some remembered his previous visit during Queen Elizabeth's reign, when protocol had been flexible. Others had only heard the rumors, but rumors in palace circles often contained more truth than fiction. James Morrison, the American ambassador to the United Kingdom, conducted his own final review of arrangements with his senior staff. He had worked tirelessly to ensure that this dinner would strengthen the bonds between their countries rather than create new sources of friction. Morrison had served in diplomatic roles across 3 different administrations, but he had never encountered a president quite like Trump. The man's ability to speak his mind, regardless of setting or audience, was both his greatest strength and his most significant diplomatic challenge. As evening approached, the palace's ancient walls seemed to hum with anticipation. Centuries of history surrounded them. These rooms had hosted everyone from Napoleon's ambassadors to modern-day world leaders. Tonight would add another chapter to that long and storied tradition, though nobody could predict exactly what that chapter would contain. The security preparations had been extensive. Both British and American protection details had conducted multiple rehearsals, mapping every possible route through the palace and identifying all emergency procedures. The King's personal protection officers worked alongside Secret Service agents, their coordination polished through years of experience protecting world leaders in challenging environments. Margaret Stevens received final confirmation that President Trump's motorcade had left the American ambassador's residence, right on schedule. Traffic along the route had been carefully managed to ensure prompt arrival, and Metropolitan Police officers lined the streets, maintaining both security and ceremony appropriate for a visiting head of state. In his private apartments, King Charles made final adjustments to his formal evening wear. The decoration and medals he chose to wear tonight would send subtle messages about the importance of this occasion and Britain's relationship with America. Each ribbon and insignia had historical significance that diplomatic observers would analyze in tomorrow's newspapers. The President's advance team had already conducted their security sweep of the dining room and reception areas. They reported that all arrangements met their standards, though several agents made note of the numerous antique weapons displayed throughout the palace's corridors. Such items were part of the royal collection's historical significance, but they represented additional security considerations that required constant monitoring. As 6:25 approached, the royal household staff took their positions throughout the palace. Footmen stood ready to assist with coats and formal wear, while senior butlers prepared to guide guests through the evening's carefully planned progression of events. The King's private secretary made final checks of the timeline, ensuring that every element would proceed smoothly from arrival through departure. Outside the palace gates, crowds had begun to gather despite the chilly February evening. Royal watchers hoped to catch glimpses of the arriving dignitaries, while political protesters prepared their own demonstrations for later in the evening. Police barricades maintained appropriate distances while allowing public interest in this historic occasion. The moment everyone had been preparing for was finally at hand. Through the tall windows of the state dining room, Margaret Stevens could see the first motorcycle escorts turning into the palace courtyard. The sound of their engines echoed off the ancient stone walls, announcing the arrival of the most unpredictable dinner guest in the palace's long and eventful history. King Charles took a deep breath and moved toward the reception area, where he would greet his American counterpart. Neither man could have imagined how dramatically this carefully planned evening was about to unfold, or how a single unguarded comment would transform a routine diplomatic dinner into a story that would captivate the world's attention. The stage was set, the players were in position, and history was about to be made in ways that no protocol manual had ever anticipated. The presidential limousine rolled to a stop beneath the palace's grand portico at exactly 6:30, its bulletproof windows reflecting the warm glow of the ornate lighting fixtures that had welcomed world leaders for generations. President Trump emerged with his characteristic confidence, adjusting his black tie while scanning the impressive facade of Britain's most famous residence. The red carpet stretched before him like a crimson river leading into the heart of British tradition and power. King Charles III waited in the doorway, resplendent in his formal evening wear, adorned with the blue ribbon and star of the Order of the Garter. His posture conveyed both dignity and welcome as he prepared to greet the leader of Britain's most important ally. The moment represented centuries of shared history, from colonial disputes to wartime partnerships to modern diplomatic cooperation. The two leaders met at the threshold with formal handshakes and diplomatic smiles, their greeting captured by photographers whose images would appear in newspapers across both continents by morning. Trump's team had briefed him extensively on royal protocol, though everyone involved understood that the president's natural inclination toward informal conversation might challenge traditional boundaries. Lady Catherine Pemberton observed the initial exchange from a discreet distance, noting the body language and energy between the two men. Years of experience at royal functions had taught her to recognize subtle signals that might indicate how an evening would develop. Tonight, she sensed an unusual dynamic that went beyond typical diplomatic courtesy. The reception preceding dinner brought together a carefully selected group of influential guests from both nations. British cabinet ministers mingled with American business leaders, while cultural figures from both sides of the Atlantic engaged in conversations designed to strengthen personal relationships that would benefit future cooperation between their countries. Secretary of State Linda Rodriguez worked the room with practiced diplomatic skill, ensuring that key relationships were being nurtured while keeping a watchful eye on her unpredictable boss. She had learned through experience that President Trump's greatest diplomatic successes often came when he was allowed to be himself. But formal royal occasions required a delicate balance between authenticity and appropriate protocol. The American ambassador introduced Trump to various British dignitaries, each introduction carefully planned to advance specific diplomatic objectives while maintaining the social atmosphere appropriate for a royal dinner. The president engaged enthusiastically with everyone he met, his natural charisma evident even within the constraints of formal protocol. British Foreign Secretary Michael Henderson found himself in extended conversation with Trump about trade relationships between their nations. The president's direct approach to complex issues often caught diplomatic veterans off guard, but Henderson had prepared extensively for these discussions and managed to maintain productive dialogue despite Trump's tendency to speak in bold, unfiltered terms. When dinner was announced, the guests proceeded to the state dining room in order of precedence that had been established through centuries of royal protocol. President Trump was seated to the king's right, the position of greatest honor that acknowledged both his status as a visiting head of state and the special relationship between their nations. The dining room itself represented the pinnacle of royal elegance, its walls adorned with portraits of monarchs and historical figures who had shaped the course of British history. The table setting featured the finest pieces from the royal collection, each item carrying its own story of previous state occasions and diplomatic triumphs. King Charles proved to be an engaging dinner companion, his extensive knowledge of American history and culture allowing him to find common ground with his guest. Despite their vastly different backgrounds and approaches to leadership, the conversation flowed easily through the first course, covering topics from architecture to environmental conservation to shared interests in various charitable causes. Trump seemed genuinely interested in the historical significance of their surroundings, asking detailed questions about the paintings, furniture, and ceremonial objects that filled the dining room. His curiosity about royal traditions appeared authentic, and several guests noted how the formal setting seemed to bring out a more reflective side of the typically boisterous president. The meal progressed through its carefully planned courses, with conversation remaining well within the bounds of diplomatic propriety. Chef Dubois had outdone himself with the presentation, and both leaders complimented the quality of the food and wine selection. The Scottish salmon had been perfectly prepared, and the Welsh lamb earned particular praise from Trump, who made a point of complimenting British agriculture and food production. Lady Catherine Pemberton began to relax slightly as the evening proceeded without incident. The conversation remained engaging but appropriate, and both leaders seemed to be enjoying themselves while maintaining the dignity expected at such occasions. Perhaps her earlier concerns about potential protocol violations had been unfounded. Ambassador Morrison exchanged satisfied glances with his British counterparts as the main course concluded without any diplomatic complications. The careful preparation and extensive briefings appeared to have succeeded in creating exactly the kind of positive interaction that would benefit future relations between their countries. The wine selection had been particularly thoughtful, featuring both British and American vintages that symbolized the partnership between their nations. Trump, not typically a wine enthusiast, nevertheless appreciated the gesture and made several complimentary remarks about the quality of the selections and the knowledge of the royal sommelier. As dessert was being prepared, King Charles began sharing stories about previous American presidents who had been guests at the palace. His anecdotes about Reagan, Clinton, Obama, and others provided fascinating insights into the personal side of international diplomacy, and Trump listened with apparent fascination to these behind-the-scenes glimpses of presidential history. The conversation naturally evolved toward more contemporary topics, including recent developments in international relations and shared challenges facing both nations. Both leaders demonstrated their command of complex issues while maintaining the conversational tone appropriate for a social dinner rather than a formal diplomatic meeting. Margaret Stevens supervised the service with her usual attention to detail, ensuring that every aspect of the meal proceeded flawlessly. The staff moved with the precision that came from years of experience at such events, anticipating needs before they were expressed, and maintaining the seamless flow that made royal occasions memorable for all the right reasons. The American delegation appeared pleased with how the evening was developing. Secretary Rodriguez engaged in productive conversations with British officials about various policy initiatives, while other members of Trump's team built relationships that would prove valuable in future diplomatic endeavors. As the final course was being served, the atmosphere in the dining room remained warm and positive. Guests from both countries had found common ground on numerous topics, and the evening appeared destined to be remembered as a successful diplomatic and social occasion that would strengthen ties between their nations. But beneath the surface of diplomatic courtesy and royal protocol, subtle tensions were beginning to build. Trump's natural tendency toward unfiltered commentary was being held in check by the formal setting, but those who knew him well could sense the energy building like pressure in a steam kettle. The king, comfortable in his role as host and experienced in managing conversations with world leaders, continued to guide the discussion through topics that would interest his guest, while avoiding potentially controversial subjects. His diplomatic skills had been honed through decades of such occasions, but tonight would test those abilities in ways he had never experienced. As coffee and after-dinner drinks were being served, the carefully maintained balance of the evening was about to shift in a direction that no amount of protocol planning could have anticipated. The coffee service had been perfectly executed, with palace staff offering a selection of premium blends alongside traditional British digestives and American bourbon in deference to their guests' preferences. The atmosphere remained convivial as smaller conversations developed around the table, creating the intimate setting that royal protocol designers hoped would foster genuine diplomatic connections. King Charles, relaxed by the evening's success thus far, began sharing more personal stories about life as a modern monarch. He spoke about the challenges of balancing centuries-old traditions with contemporary expectations, a topic that seemed to resonate with Trump's own experience of navigating between established political conventions and his unconventional approach to leadership. The president appeared genuinely engaged by these insights into royal life, asking thoughtful questions about the daily realities of monarchy in the 21st century. His curiosity about the practical aspects of running what was essentially the world's oldest family business showed a side of him that few outside his inner circle ever witnessed. Lady Catherine Pemberton noticed how the conversation had evolved from formal diplomatic discourse to something approaching genuine friendship between the two leaders. Years of observing royal interactions had taught her to recognize authentic moments amid the carefully choreographed elements of state occasions, and this felt remarkably real. As the evening progressed toward its planned conclusion, King Charles made what seemed like an innocent observation about the elaborate nature of royal ceremonies and traditions. He mentioned how some critics viewed such formality as outdated in modern democratic societies, but explained his belief that ceremony and ritual served important purposes in providing stability and continuity during times of change. Trump nodded thoughtfully, then leaned slightly forward with the expression that his staff had learned to recognize as the prelude to one of his unfiltered observations. Ambassador Morrison, catching sight of this familiar gesture, felt his stomach tighten with anticipation of what might come next. The president began his response in measured tones, acknowledging the king's perspective on the value of tradition and ceremony. But then, as often happened when Trump felt comfortable with his audience, his natural tendency toward blunt commentary began to emerge. He started comparing American political ceremonies with British royal traditions, initially making respectful observations about their different approaches to pageantry and public events. Secretary Rodriguez, seated several places away but keeping one ear tuned to her boss's conversation, began to sense a shift in his tone that experience had taught her to monitor carefully. She caught the eye of the American ambassador, who was already alert to the changing dynamic at the head table. What happened next would be debated and analyzed by diplomatic experts for years to come. Trump, warming to his theme about the differences between American and British approaches to ceremony, began offering his personal assessment of various aspects of royal tradition. His comments started as observations, but gradually evolved into something approaching critique. The king maintained his composure with the skill that comes from a lifetime of managing awkward social situations, but several guests noticed a subtle change in his expression as Trump's commentary became increasingly direct. Lady Catherine Pemberton later described feeling as though time had slowed down as she watched the conversation develop in real time. Trump's remarks centered on what he characterized as the excessive formality of certain royal protocols, suggesting that American approaches to leadership ceremonies were more efficient and accessible to ordinary citizens. He questioned whether some traditional elements of monarchy might be better adapted to contemporary expectations about democratic leadership. The specific comment that would later make headlines came when Trump suggested that certain aspects of the royal banquet itself seemed designed more for show than for genuine diplomatic effectiveness. He wondered aloud whether simpler, more direct approaches might actually produce better results in building international relationships. King Charles responded with characteristic grace, acknowledging that different cultures had developed different approaches to leadership and ceremony based on their unique histories and traditions. But observers noted a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the president's comments had struck closer to home than diplomatic courtesy would normally allow. Margaret Stevens, monitoring the conversation from her position near the service area, felt the familiar sensation that every protocol officer dreaded: the moment when carefully laid plans began to unravel despite everyone's best efforts. She began calculating how to gracefully transition the evening toward its planned conclusion, while minimizing any potential diplomatic fallout. The other guests had gradually become aware that something unusual was happening at the head table. Conversations around the room grew quieter as people strained to catch fragments of the exchange between their hosts. The American delegation looked increasingly uncomfortable, while their British counterparts maintained expressions of polite attention that masked their growing concern. Trump, seemingly oblivious to the effect his comments were having on the room, continued with observations about leadership styles and public ceremonies that grew progressively more pointed. He compared what he saw as British attachment to outdated traditions with American willingness to modernize and improve their approaches to governance and public service. The king's responses became increasingly brief, though he maintained perfect courtesy throughout the exchange. His years of training in diplomatic protocol served him well, but several long-time royal watchers later noted that they had never seen him work quite so hard to maintain composure during a formal occasion. Lady Catherine Pemberton made the decision to intervene indirectly by suggesting that the evening's program should move toward its traditional conclusion with toasts and farewell remarks. Her suggestion provided both leaders with a graceful exit from their increasingly awkward conversation, while maintaining the dignity that such occasions required. The formal toast proceeded according to protocol, with both men offering appropriate remarks about friendship between their nations and hopes for continued cooperation. But observers noted a subtle tension beneath the diplomatic language that had not been present earlier in the evening. As guests began preparing for departure, small groups formed around the room to discuss what they had witnessed. Diplomats from both countries engaged in careful conversations about how to interpret and potentially minimize any negative implications of the evening's unexpected turn. Ambassador Morrison approached his British counterparts to engage in the delicate process of diplomatic damage control, while Secretary Rodriguez began planning conversations with American media contacts to shape how the evening would be reported in the press. The president himself seemed satisfied with the evening, apparently unaware that his candid observations had created the kind of diplomatic incident that would require careful management in the days to come. As he prepared to depart, he thanked the king warmly for his hospitality and expressed genuine appreciation for the insight into British royal traditions. King Charles maintained perfect courtesy through the farewell process, though those who knew him well recognized signs of strain beneath his gracious exterior. He had hosted many challenging diplomatic occasions throughout his life, but few had tested his skills quite like tonight's unexpected encounter with American directness. The presidential motorcade departed Buckingham Palace precisely on schedule, carrying Trump back into the London night while leaving behind a story that would dominate diplomatic conversations for weeks to come. The carefully planned evening had indeed strengthened understanding between the two leaders, though perhaps not in exactly the way that anyone had anticipated. In the days that followed, Palace insiders would speak in hushed tones about the night when diplomatic protocol met Trump's unfiltered commentary, creating a memorable chapter in the long history of Anglo-American relations. The evening had provided exactly the kind of authentic diplomatic exchange that both countries needed, even if the path to that understanding had proved more eventful than anyone had planned. The true measure of the evening's success would ultimately be determined not by adherence to protocol, but by whether the genuine communication between two very different leaders would translate into stronger cooperation between their nations. As history would later record, sometimes the most effective diplomacy happens when carefully planned scripts give way to honest, if uncomfortable, conversations about the realities of leadership in the modern world.